On January 26, 1945, in Holtzwihr, France, a German soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division watched through the window of an aid station as medics carried in the wounded. His unit had just launched an attack with 250 men and 6 tanks against a lone American lieutenant standing on a burning tank destroyer. The American had only 1 machine gun. Within an hour, the German force had been reduced to 70 effective soldiers. The survivors spoke of nothing but the weapon that had stopped them in their tracks. That weapon was not a secret German marvel, but a simple American machine gun, the Browning M2 to 50 caliber heavy machine gun, which had first rolled off production lines in 1933. Yet, this weapon would become one of the most feared in the American arsenal. Not because of its complexity, but because of its brutal, relentless effectiveness. The German survivors had just witnessed one of the most legendary engagements in American military history. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy, wounded and alone, climbed aboard a burning M10 tank destroyer and used its turret-mounted 50 caliber machine gun to take on an entire German infantry company supported by armor. For over an hour, Murphy fired the weapon with such devastating force that the German attack completely disintegrated. The official Medal of Honor citation, awarded by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch on June 2, 1945, confirmed that Murphy inflicted approximately 50 casualties on the attacking force. The damage caused by 50 caliber rounds became grimly familiar to German medical personnel. Unlike rifle rounds, which might wound and allow for recovery, a 50 caliber projectiles caused catastrophic damage. A hit to a limb often resulted in amputation, while a hit to the torso was almost always fatal. German field hospitals near the front learned to recognize 50 caliber casualties by the nature of their wounds. Many wounded soldiers never made it to the hospitals, and the medical impact extended beyond direct casualties. German units under sustained 50 caliber fire suffered psychological trauma, combat exhaustion, and a breakdown in unit cohesion at rates higher than units that faced conventional small arms fire. From Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from North Africa to the skies over Germany, German soldiers came to recognize and fear the distinctive sound of the M2 Browning, firing between 450 and 575 rounds per minute. Each massive 50 caliber round carried enough energy to punch through light armor, tear through concrete, and turn human bodies into unrecognizable wreckage. The transformation from skepticism to terror had begun 3 years earlier. American industrial might had written its own story, not in production statistics, but in the experience of German soldiers who faced this weapon and survived to tell about it. What the Germans discovered shattered their understanding of modern warfare and revealed a profound truth about American military doctrine. The United States had not built the most sophisticated heavy machine gun, but rather something far more dangerous, the most reliable, most ubiquitous, and most psychologically devastating crew-served weapon in history. The hatred toward the weapon didn't start with fear but with contempt. On September 6, 1943, 388 B-17 flying fortresses approached Germany's industrial heartland for the first major daylight raid on Stuttgart. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled to intercept, confident in their Foch, Wolf 190 aircraft armed with 420 Nammed cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. As they closed in on the bombers, they opened fire at 800 meters. Then something happened that would forever change German pilots' understanding of air combat. The bombers erupted with fire, not smoke from damaged aircraft, but muzzle flashes. Each B-17 carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns. A typical formation of 36 bombers meant 468 heavy machine guns, all firing the same 50 caliber rounds capable of reaching 830 meters with lethal effect. The combined defensive firepower of the formation exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute, creating an impenetrable wall of steel. German fighters felt their aircraft shudder as 50 caliber rounds tore into their wings, engines, and canopies. The attack was devastating, and while 45 B-17s were lost, the German fighter units suffered catastrophic losses. What the German pilots didn't yet understand was that they weren't just encountering a weapon. They were facing a philosophy of warfare. The Americans had solved the problem of bomber defense, not through technological sophistication, but through overwhelming volume of fire. Each B-17G carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across 13 gun positions, with some crews adding extra ammunition beyond regulations. The Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to fear 20 mm and 30 mm cannons because those weapons could destroy a bomber with a single well-placed shot. But the American .50 caliber didn't need to explode. The massive projectiles simply punched holes in everything they touched: wings, engines, fuel tanks, and pilots. By October 1943, German fighter units began to understand the true danger. Luftwaffe Ace Oberleutnant Heinrich Wurmela, with 93 victories, described the American bomber formations in a letter to his family. To attack the Americans is to fly through a storm of steel. You see the tracers, 1 round in 5, and you know that for every tracer you see, 4 more bullets you cannot see are flying past. When you close to effective cannon range, you are already inside their killing zone. The Germans adapted their tactics, trying head-on attacks, diving from above, climbing from below, attacking from the sides. Nothing worked consistently. The American gunners had overlapping fields of fire, and there was no safe approach. The United States Army Air Forces had arranged their combat box formations in 3-dimensional space to maximize defensive fire. But the real horror was not just the volume of fire. It was the reliability. German pilots flying the Me-109 or FDO-190 knew that their cannons were prone to jamming, especially at high altitudes in the cold. The American Browning M2, however, simply worked. It fired continuously for hours, even when hit by German cannon fire. It kept shooting even when the barrels glowed red from sustained fire. American maintenance crews could replace overheated barrels in minutes and get the gun back into action without missing a beat. Luftwaffe ace Wolfgang Fischer, who flew bomber intercept missions over the Reich, later testified at post-war debriefings. His words captured the growing realization among German aircrews. We called the American bomber formations Die Fliegenden Festungen, the flying fortresses. But what made them true fortresses was not their armor or formation discipline. It was those .50 caliber machine guns that never stopped firing, never jammed, and never gave us an opening. We lost so many pilots, not to American fighters, but to the bomber defensive fire. It was like flying into a meat grinder. The ground war told the same story, but with different details. On June 6, 1944, during the Normandy invasion, Oberst Hans von Luck commanded elements of the 21st Panzer Division, which defended against the Allied invasion. Von Luck was no ordinary officer. He had fought at El Alamein, earned the Knight's Cross, and would later publish his memoir, Panzer Commander. His division was among the first German units to face sustained combat against American forces. What von Luck discovered was that American doctrine had integrated .50 caliber machine guns across nearly every combat vehicle: jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, tanks, tank destroyers, and even supply vehicles were all equipped with them for convoy protection. The Americans had achieved something the Germans had never attempted: universal heavy machine gun coverage throughout their entire force structure. In his memoir, von Luck wrote about the tactical implications of this. We had been taught that our training and tactics would overcome the American material advantage, he said. At Normandy, I learned the truth. The Americans didn't need superior tactics. They had enough ammunition to make mistakes and still win. Their .50 caliber machine guns were on every vehicle, every position, firing continuously. We couldn't move in daylight. Any attempt to maneuver immediately drew overwhelming fire. The psychological effect was just as destructive as the physical casualties. The German army had built its infantry doctrine around machine guns. Weapons like the MG34 and its successor, the MG42, were excellent, and the MG42 earned the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw for its high rate of fire. German squads carried 800 rounds per machine gun and organized their tactics around supporting the gun crew. But they had never anticipated the scale at which the Americans employed .50 caliber weapons. A single American armored division advancing through France had hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns mounted on vehicles. American supply convoys used a pattern of alternating fire, one vehicle shooting right, the next shooting left, to cover both flanks and disrupt German ambushes. This tactic proved particularly effective against German Panzerfaust teams trying to engage American tanks at close range. American armored columns also used a tactic called reconnaissance by fire. Rather than carefully advancing and waiting for the enemy to reveal their positions, American units would fire their .50 caliber machine guns continuously into any suspicious location, tree lines, farm buildings, stone walls, or hedgerows. The sheer volume of fire either suppressed German positions or forced them to reveal their locations. German infantry veterans from the Eastern Front, who thought they had seen the worst of industrial warfare against the Soviets, found themselves shocked by American firepower in France. German squad leaders who survived the fighting in Normandy and were later taken prisoner described the difference in their debriefings, preserved in U.S. Army historical files. Against the Russians, we faced human wave attacks and artillery barrages. Against the Americans, we faced machine gun fire that never stopped. They fired at everything. They fired at nothing. They fired to make us keep our heads down. They fired to prevent us from moving. They fired because they had unlimited ammunition, and we did not. The M16 multiple gun motor carriage epitomized American firepower philosophy. This half-track mounted 4.50 caliber machine guns in a powered turret originally designed for anti-aircraft defense. The combined rate of fire approached 200 rounds per minute. American soldiers nicknamed it the meat chopper, or crowd mower. In November 1944, the 473rd Battalion reported that the M16's primary mission, anti-aircraft defense, often became secondary. The vehicle was used against ground troops with devastating effectiveness. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had been largely defeated over Western Europe, so American anti-aircraft units were repurposed for ground support. The M16 proved highly effective against German infantry and light vehicles. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces launched their last major offensive in the West, M16 units helped break up several German infantry attacks simply by sweeping their 4.50 caliber guns across attacking formations. The experience of German forces trying to ambush American supply convoys illustrates why the .50 caliber became so feared. German doctrine for convoy ambushes called for allowing the lead vehicles to pass, then destroying those in the middle to create a roadblock, and systematically destroying the trapped convoy. This tactic had been effective against British and Soviet supply lines, but against American convoys, it failed catastrophically. American convoy doctrine placed .50 caliber armed vehicles at intervals throughout the column. When ambushes were initiated, American vehicles immediately returned fire with their .50 calibers, while others maneuvered to flank the ambush positions. The volume of return fire was so intense that German ambush teams often suffered heavier casualties than the convoys they tried to attack. German platoon leaders involved in convoy ambushes described the evolution of their tactics and their ultimate failure during post-war interrogations. Early on, German forces positioned infantry with machine guns and Panzerfausts along roads to attack isolated vehicles. But American convoys with vehicles equipped with .50 caliber machine guns proved nearly impossible to ambush. By mid-1944, German forces learned to avoid attacking convoys altogether, focusing instead on isolated vehicles, but even that tactic became increasingly rare. The Americans moved in strength precisely because they knew the Germans couldn't effectively target their convoys. The alternating fire tactic used by American convoys was particularly effective. Vehicles on the right side of the road would fire into the right flank, while vehicles on the left side would fire to the left. This created intersecting fields of fire, covering both sides of the road simultaneously. German forces trying to ambush from one side would find themselves under fire from both sides of the convoy. The psychological impact of being fired upon from multiple directions by weapons capable of penetrating cover, with seemingly unlimited ammunition, made successful ambushes nearly impossible. American logistics units understood that the .50 caliber machine gun was their primary defense. Drivers and assistant drivers were trained on the weapon, and ammunition was stocked in quantities far exceeding official allocations. Convoy commanders were authorized to engage any suspected threat with overwhelming fire. This strategy ensured that, by mid to late 1944, American convoys faced little risk of disruption, even in areas where the Germans still had some local superiority. This logistical superiority had strategic implications. American units could rely on regular resupply of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. German forces, in contrast, had to contend with chronic shortages of ammunition and fuel, and whatever supplies did arrive were often delayed or insufficient. The .50 caliber machine gun was both a cause and a symptom of American logistical dominance. Its effectiveness was rooted not only in its firepower, but also in the U.S. industrial capacity to produce vast quantities of ammunition. For German soldiers, seeing American tracer fire arc across the battlefield at night was a visible reminder of the overwhelming industrial power they could never match. The terror from the air added another layer to German fear of the .50 caliber. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug by American pilots, carried 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns in its wings. A single P-47 could deliver 400 rounds per minute of combined firepower during strafing runs. German ground forces learned to recognize the distinctive shape of the P-47 and the sound of its engines before they heard the deadly barrage. A strafing run by a flight of 4 P-47s meant 250 the .50 caliber machine guns converging on a target area. The effect was described by survivors as a horizontal rainstorm of metal that left nothing intact. German supply sergeants, who survived multiple strafing attacks during the retreat from Normandy in August 1944, spoke of the helplessness they felt against American air power. "You hear the engines first," one sergeant recalled. "By the time you look up, they're already firing. The bullets hit the road, the vehicles, the men, all at once. There is no cover that works. Stone walls crumble. Trees are cut down. Metal tears like paper. You can be behind a truck one moment and the next, it's just pieces of metal and fire." German forces adapted by moving primarily at night and in bad weather, but this came at a heavy cost. The need to move under such conditions slowed their operational tempo and severely disrupted logistics. Supplies that should have taken hours to move required days, and reinforcements arrived late or not at all. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's inability to contest American air superiority meant that German ground forces operated under constant threat from the air. The primary weapon delivering this threat was the .50 caliber machine gun. The combination of ground-mounted and air-delivered .50 caliber fire created an overwhelming suppression effect. German units could not move safely in daylight due to strafing attacks. They could not move at night because American ground forces used reconnaissance by fire with vehicle-mounted .50 calibers to target roads and trails. They could not concentrate forces for counterattacks because American doctrine called for immediate engagement of any identified German formation with all available firepower, including .50 caliber machine guns that could fire continuously while other weapons were brought into play. This was the reality that broke German combat effectiveness in the West. Not a single decisive battle, not a wonder weapon, but the cumulative effect of facing an opponent whose basic heavy machine gun was present in overwhelming quantities, employed relentlessly, making traditional military responses irrelevant. German tactical doctrine, training, and fighting spirit all proved ineffective against the simple mathematical reality that American forces could deliver superior firepower to any point on the battlefield faster than the Germans could respond. A German infantry battalion attacking an American position might face 50 to 150 .50 caliber machine guns, all firing continuously and all supplied with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German doctrine emphasized careful fire discipline to conserve ammunition, while American doctrine called for overwhelming volumes of fire to suppress the enemy and maintain initiative. When these two philosophies collided, American material superiority proved decisive. Urban combat revealed another aspect of the .50 caliber's effectiveness. As American forces fought through French towns and German cities, the .50 caliber was invaluable for suppressing enemy positions in buildings and destroying fortified structures. Its massive projectiles could penetrate multiple walls of typical European construction. Masonry that could stop rifle or machine gun fire offered little protection against .50 caliber rounds. American tank commanders quickly learned to use their turret-mounted .50 calibers to suppress upper-story windows and rooftop positions before advancing through urban areas. The technique was simple but highly effective. A tank would halt at a street corner, and the commander would traverse the .50 caliber across the building facades, firing continuously at any potential enemy positions. The sustained fire forced German defenders to take cover, allowing infantry to advance. The tank would then move forward and repeat the process at the next intersection. German panzer teams, which were highly effective in open terrain and particularly dangerous in urban environments, found themselves ineffective against American combined arms tactics that integrated 50 caliber suppressive fire. A Panzerfaust operator needed to expose himself to aim and fire his weapon, but American doctrine called for continuous 50 caliber fire on any suspected position. This combination made successful Panzerfaust attacks rare in situations where American forces used proper combined arms coordination. German company commanders who fought American forces in the Rhineland during the final months of the war described the impossibility of effective defense in urban terrain against American tactics. German infantry would position themselves in upper-story rooms with good fields of fire, but American tanks would approach and destroy the buildings with the 50 caliber fire and tank main guns. The 50 caliber rounds would penetrate walls and ceilings, leaving no safe place for the defenders. Soldiers would take cover behind furniture or interior walls, only to have the bullets find them anyway. The only way to survive was to abandon positions before the Americans concentrated their fire on them. But abandoning positions meant losing ground, and there was no ground left to lose. The psychological impact of fighting in urban terrain against an enemy with unlimited 50 caliber ammunition was profound. German soldiers understood that walls and buildings provided concealment, but not protection against 50 caliber fire. Emotionally, the human need to seek shelter behind solid objects was overwhelming. Watching 50 caliber rounds punch through thick stone walls and continue through multiple rooms destroyed the psychological comfort that shelter usually provided. Soldiers felt exposed even when hidden, vulnerable even when protected by what should have been adequate cover. This psychological erosion was cumulative. A soldier might survive one engagement, then another, but each time watching 50 caliber fire destroy what should have been safe cover. Eventually, the accumulated stress of knowing that no position was truly safe, that the Americans could and would destroy any defensive position with sustained fire, broke German combat effectiveness. Units would abandon positions without being directly assaulted because they knew American firepower would eventually make those positions untenable. The final campaigns in Germany showed the complete superiority of American firepower doctrine. German forces fought with courage and skill, often achieving local tactical successes against numerically superior American forces. But tactical success meant nothing when American forces could simply mass firepower and reduce German positions to rubble. The 50 caliber machine gun was the foundation of this firepower. It was present in sufficient quantities to engage any target. It was reliable enough to fire continuously for hours, and it was supplied with enough ammunition that American commanders never needed to ration fire. It was employed according to doctrine that valued suppression and destruction over conservation and precision. German tank crews feared the 50 caliber for different reasons. While the M2 could not penetrate the frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks, it could damage optical equipment, disable external stowage, and suppress accompanying infantry. More importantly, the 50 caliber could penetrate the thinner side and rear armor of many German armored vehicles at combat ranges. American M10 tank destroyers carried the 50 caliber M2HB machine gun mounted on the rear of the turret for anti-aircraft defense and close infantry protection. Statistical analysis of ammunition expenditure shows that M10s fired far more high explosive shells than armor-piercing rounds, indicating extensive use in infantry support roles, where the 50 caliber was critical for cleanup operations in close quarters. A German panzer team might disable an American tank, only to be cut down by 50 caliber fire from accompanying tank destroyers or infantry support vehicles before they could escape. Night combat added another layer of terror associated with the 50 caliber. American ammunition used a ratio of 1 tracer round for every 4 ball rounds. This meant that for every fifth 50 caliber bullet visible to the enemy, a glowing tracer marked its trajectory. German soldiers watching American 50 caliber fire at night could see the tracers arcing toward them. Streaks of light that seemed slow enough to track visually, but that arrived with devastating speed and force. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers could see death approaching. They could watch the tracers converge on their position and knew that for every tracer they saw, 4 additional rounds were following the same path. The human instinct to duck or dodge was useless because by the time a soldier saw the tracer, the rounds had already arrived. Veterans learned not to focus on the tracers, but new replacements often fixated on them, mesmerized by the deadly light show, freezing in the open until the fire found them. American forces exploited this psychological effect deliberately. Reconnaissance by fire at night meant sending streams of tracer-laden, 50 caliber fire across suspected positions. The visual effect was overwhelming. Entire sectors would light up with intersecting streams of tracers, creating a psychological barrier that made it nearly impossible for German soldiers to operate effectively. The noise of constant firing combined with the visual impact created a hellish environment for German soldiers. Infantry squad leaders captured near Aachen in October 1944 described the experience during their interrogations. At night, you can see them shooting even when they cannot see you. They fire at sounds, at movement, at nothing. The tracers show you where death is coming from, and you cannot escape it. You watch the streams of fire and know that behind every tracer, there are 4 more bullets. You calculate that one gun firing for 10 seconds sends 50 rounds toward you, and only 10 are tracers. You see 10 streaks of light, and know 40 more rounds are in the air. Then you realize there are not 1, but 5 or 10 guns firing. The mathematics of it are terrifying. You cannot survive that volume of fire by skill or courage. You survive by luck alone. The Germans had their own tracer ammunition, but their doctrine of fire discipline meant they used tracers sparingly. A German machine gun crew might fire a burst with tracers to verify their aim, then switch to ball ammunition to conserve the more expensive tracer rounds. American crews, on the other hand, fired mixed belts continuously. The visual impact of American firepower at night was far more overwhelming than the German equivalent. Even though German weapons often had higher rates of fire, this visual dominance had practical effects beyond intimidation. American commanders could observe their own fire and adjust it in real time. If tracers were falling short of a target, the gunner could see this and correct immediately. German return fire was harder to observe because they used fewer tracers. As a result, American units had better real-time feedback on the effectiveness of their fire, which allowed them to concentrate their fire more effectively than German forces, who were more conservative with tracer ammunition. The Germans attempted to develop countermeasures. They tried using armor more aggressively to close with American positions before the 50 caliber fire became overwhelming. However, this rarely worked because American artillery and air support would engage German armor at longer ranges, forcing them to fight at the distances where 50 caliber fire was most effective. The Germans also tried infiltration tactics, moving at night and in bad weather when American observation was limited. But American logistics ensured that 50 caliber ammunition was always available, and American doctrine encouraged firing at any suspected position regardless of whether targets were confirmed. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy began with 300 tons of bombs dropped by 1-800 heavy bombers on German positions near St. L. General Major Fritz Bain, who commanded the Panzer Division defending the sector, later wrote extensively for the U.S. Army Historical Division analyzing the campaign. His assessment of American firepower was clinical and devastating. He wrote that by the time his division retreated from the St. L sector, it had been decimated not primarily by bombing or artillery, though those were significant, but by the cumulative effect of constant small arms, fire that prevented his forces from maneuvering effectively. American 50 caliber machine guns mounted on every vehicle meant that his troops could not move to respond to American advances without being immediately engaged. His conclusion was that the Americans had solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare. They had found a way to project superior firepower without requiring superior training or tactics. Bain's post-war writings became crucial sources for understanding German perspectives on American combat methods. He noted repeatedly that the 50 caliber machine gun, operated by soldiers with minimal specialized training and supplied with vast quantities of ammunition, created a baseline of firepower that German forces could not match, even with their more sophisticated weapons and better trained crews. The winter of 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise and initial success. For the first few days, it seemed possible that German armor might break through to the Meuse River and split the Allied armies. But then American logistics reasserted itself, and with it, the 50 caliber machine gun. American units rushed to the Ardennes, carrying their standard load of ammunition and equipment. This meant that even ad hoc defensive positions could bring devastating volumes of 50 caliber fire to bear on German attacks. The battle became a grinding war of attrition that favored American material superiority. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces used their 50 caliber machine guns to devastating effect against German infantry attacks. The guns operated reliably despite freezing temperatures, mud, snow, and the chaos of sustained combat. German forces made a critical mistake in their planning for the Bulge offensive. They assumed that bad weather would ground American air power, reducing the effectiveness of American fire superiority. They were partially right. The weather did initially limit air operations, but they failed to account for the fact that ground-mounted 50 caliber machine guns were unaffected by weather, and American logistics could sustain ammunition expenditure at rates the Germans found incomprehensible. General Alfred Scheel, who commanded the German 1st Parachute Army from November 1944 to March 1945, later discussed the psychological impact of American firepower. By early 1945, German soldiers had learned to recognize the sound of American 50 caliber fire from great distances. The knowledge that any position could be engaged by these weapons, that any movement could draw immediate fire, and that German forces had no effective counter, created what Scheel described as a defensive mentality that made offensive operations nearly impossible. His forces successfully evacuated across the Rhine before the final Allied push, but he attributed his casualties primarily to the constant attrition caused by American heavy machine gun fire during the retreat. The technical specifications of the M2 Browning help explain its effectiveness. The weapon weighed 84 libs without a tripod and 128 libs with the M3 tripod mount. This made it heavy, but still manageable for a crew-served weapon. The effective range of 830 meters allowed it to engage targets well beyond the range of German rifles and light machine guns. The M2's rate of fire, between 450 and 575 rounds per minute, was slower than the German MG42, but the faster fire rates meant little when German crews had limited ammunition. The 50 caliber Browning M2 cartridge had specifications that made it effective against a wide range of targets. The standard M33 ball round achieved a muzzle velocity of 2.910 feet per second. Armor-piercing variants could penetrate 19 mm of armor at 500 meters, while the M8 API's armor-piercing incendiary round penetrated 16 mm and would ignite fuel or ammunition on impact. The M20 API variant, with a tracer element, could penetrate 21 mm at the same range. While the 50 caliber could not defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther tank, it could penetrate the thinner side and rear armor of many German armored vehicles at combat ranges. More importantly, it could disable truck engines, puncture fuel tanks, destroy artillery pieces, and suppress infantry at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The M2's reliability stemmed from its design. It could fire continuously for hours, in extreme temperatures ranging from 40 F to the 40 F, and even after being hit by enemy fire. This made the 50 caliber machine gun an indispensable asset in combat, with unmatched reliability and firepower that wore down German forces over time. John Browning began developing the 50 caliber machine gun in July 1917, during World War I. The first version, the M1921 water-cooled model, weighed 121 libs with its water jacket, but it was too heavy for mobile warfare. In 1933, the M2 air-cooled version was introduced, eliminating the water cooling system and reducing the weight while maintaining the weapon's reliability. The basic design principles of the M2 were simple, robust, and proven. During the war, American manufacturers including AC Spark Plug, Frigidaire, Guide Lamp, and Colt produced nearly 2 million 50 caliber machine guns of various models. Production of the M2HB, the heavy barrel version capable of sustained fire, reached about 350,000 units across all branches and theaters. This scale of production ensured that American forces always had a steady supply of replacement weapons and spare parts. The Germans understood the threat they faced. While their weapons, such as the MG34 and MG42, were more sophisticated in some respects, and their MG131 aircraft machine gun had a higher rate of fire at 900 rounds per minute. These factors were irrelevant in the face of overwhelming American material superiority. The Americans had created a weapon that was good enough for every role it needed to fulfill, and produced it in quantities that allowed for universal deployment. Every American bomber carried 13 M2s, every fighter like the P-47 Thunderbolt had 8, and every combat vehicle had at least one. American infantry companies had their own 50 caliber heavy machine gun sections, and anti-aircraft units could repurpose their M16 quad mounts for ground combat. The weapon was everywhere, always available, always supplied with ample ammunition, and always functional when needed. The psychological impact on German forces was cumulative and devastating. While individual soldiers might survive encounters with 50 caliber fire, and units might complete tactical missions despite American firepower superiority, the constant knowledge that Americans could bring overwhelming firepower to bear at any time wore down German combat effectiveness. This was not cowardice on the part of German soldiers. These were veteran troops who had fought across Europe and North Africa, and many had faced Soviet attacks on the Eastern Front. But there was something uniquely demoralizing about the American approach to warfare. The Soviets might use mass human wave tactics and artillery, and the British might demonstrate tactical excellence, but the Americans simply deployed overwhelming material resources and fired relentlessly until resistance collapsed. German officers found it increasingly difficult to motivate their men to attack when they knew that American 50 caliber fire would meet any advance. German infantry became reluctant to maneuver in daylight, and German vehicles clustered in cover rather than advancing. The tactical initiative shifted permanently to the Americans, not because of superior tactics or better training, but because American doctrine, built on unlimited ammunition and reliable weapons, made German doctrine obsolete. The resentment German soldiers felt toward the 50 caliber was not just fear of the weapon, but the frustration of craftsmen facing mass production, of skilled warriors facing industrial warfare. The 50 caliber machine gun represented everything about American warfare that the Germans found alien: the casual expenditure of ammunition, the reliance on material superiority over skill, and the willingness to destroy rather than capture or bypass. These were not the methods of soldiers in the traditional European sense, but the methods of an industrial power that calculated material expenditure was cheaper than casualties and more effective than tactical elegance. After the war, German military historians and former officers consistently assessed the impact of the American 50 caliber machine gun. It was not the most sophisticated weapon of World War II, nor the fastest firing, most accurate, lightest, or most versatile. It was simply the most effective because it combined reliability, ubiquity, and overwhelming logistical support. The weapon itself was only part of the equation. The system that produced it by the millions, supplied it with billions of rounds of ammunition, and employed it according to a doctrine that accepted material expenditure as the price of victory, was what defeated Germany. The legacy of the M2 Browning can be seen in its continued use. 80 years after production began, the M2 remains in active service with the U.S. military and armed forces around the world. It has outlasted every weapon system that opposed it in World War II, serving in every American conflict from World War II to the present. This longevity reflects the fundamental soundness of the design and the effectiveness of the American military philosophy it embodies. The broader strategic implications became clear only in hindsight. German military planners had assumed that superior training and tactical excellence could offset American numerical advantages. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The 50 caliber machine gun demonstrated that adequate weapons, produced in overwhelming quantities and supplied without restriction, trumped sophisticated weapons produced in limited numbers and supplied sparingly. German tank commanders, who had defeated Soviet armor with superior tactics, found themselves unable to maneuver against American combined arms teams that included multiple 50 caliber machine guns. German infantry, who had mastered the tactical intricacies of the MG42, found their expertise irrelevant when American forces could simply saturate defensive positions with sustained 50 caliber fire. German pilots, who had honed their skills against the RAF, found themselves shredded by defensive fire from bomber formations that valued volume over precision. The lesson was clear and unforgiving in industrial warfare. The side that can sustain higher material expenditure will prevail, regardless of tactical skill disparities. The Germans had brought a craftsman's approach to a mass production war. They had optimized for efficiency when the situation demanded overwhelming force. They had conserved ammunition when their opponents could afford to expend it freely. What German soldiers learned through bitter experience was that modern industrial warfare rewards not tactical brilliance or superior training, but the capacity to sustain overwhelming material expenditure. The M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine gun became the symbol and instrument of that lesson. German forces brought skill, doctrine, and determination to the battlefield. American forces brought an industrial system capable of producing and supplying heavy machine guns in quantities that made resistance mathematically futile. When these two approaches to warfare collided, the outcome was never truly in doubt.